All right, guys, let's talk about narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, chapter 3. And in this chapter, it really focuses on Colonel Lloyd, who was Frederick Douglass's master. And I wanted to point out his wealth. Look a few paragraphs down, and we'll get back to the beginning of the chapter in just a moment here, but I wanted to point out this paragraph here. Describe the wealth of Colonel Lloyd would be almost equal to describing the riches of Job. Do you remember the biblical story of Job who had, you know, absolute wealth? He had many sheep, goats, he had, you know, what was it, like 10 children? He had servants. He was a wealthy, wealthy man, well known, wealthy man. And so Frederick Douglass uses this allusion to kind of point to his readers that Colonel Lloyd was very wealthy. And look at how many slaves he owned. And even the slaves themselves didn't even know who Colonel Lloyd was because he owned so many slaves that he seldom had to go out. And look at how he would sometimes meet one of his own slaves out there and say, "Whom do you belong to?" And the slave would answer, "To Colonel Lloyd." And Colonel Lloyd would say, "Well, does the colonel treat you well?" And if a slave answered, "No, sir." "What, does he work you too hard?" "Yes, sir." And so if the slaves responded positively, if you see in the next paragraph, they were often punished for that. And so we'll talk a little bit about the way these slaves were punished under Colonel Lloyd, which is a huge theme, an important aspect. And so there's more stuff that you should be adding to your active reading guide in terms of people and places. And in your summary, make sure you're talking about what's going on here. And so Colonel Lloyd was really rich and he loved his horses, and I want to talk about this part of the chapter where we hear of old Barney and young Barney who were in charge of taking care of the horses. And look at this sentence: the slightest inattention to these was unpardonable, meaning his horses, and was visited upon those under whose care they were placed with the severest punishment. No excuse could shield them. And some examples are if they weren't, if they hadn't been sufficiently rubbed, properly fed, food was too wet or too dry, he got in too soon or too late, was too hot or too cold. These horses, if they were improperly treated, the slaves who were human beings got punished. And it's just so sad and diabolic that the horses were treated better than the slaves who took care of the horses. And so here's an example of old Barney, who was probably didn't do anything bad to the horse, but just wasn't to Colonel Lloyd's liking. And so look at the end of this paragraph here. Colonel Lloyd could not brook any contradiction from a slave. When he spoke, a slave must stand, listen, and tremble. And such was literally the case. I have seen Colonel Lloyd make old Barney, a man between 50 and 60 years of age. So this is an old, seasoned man, probably a grandfather. But this man, he had to uncover his bald head, kneel down upon the cold, damp ground, and receive upon his naked and toil-worn shoulders more than 30 lashes at the time. 30 whips. That's how he was treated. A guy who took care of the horses was treated worse than the horse. And this theme of the dehumanization and treatment of the slaves continues towards the end here, where there were these spies among the slaves, um, who would kind of tell back to the slave owners what the slaves were saying about their condition. And so these spies, if they heard a slave talking poorly about their master, they would report the slave, and the slave would get punished. And so I want to end with the very end. Interestingly, a still tongue makes a wise head, so just don't say anything. So towards the end of the paragraph, there's this weird paradox that's created. Um, where, let me see if I can find it here. Um, yeah, so they suppressed the truth rather than telling the consequences of telling it. If they had anything to say to of their masters, is generally in their master's favor, especially when speaking to an untried man. So whenever someone would ask them how they're being treated by their master, they would say that they were being treated very kindly. And interestingly, they started buying into this. And so, under their own prejudice, they started thinking that their slaves were, or their slave owners were good people. Um, just such a weird paradox where these slaves are even fighting amongst each other, saying that their slave owner is better than the other slave owner. You know, kind of this whole my dad is stronger, my dad is better than your dad, but it's my slave owner, my owner is better than your owner, and they would fight. They would fight to show that their master is better than the other slave's master. But the weird irony in it is that they're both slave owners. And so, look at how he ends with this chapter. It was considered as bad as being bad enough to be a slave, but to be a poor man's slave was deemed a disgrace indeed. So there's this notion, this philosophy that, yeah, it's bad that you're a slave, but if you're a slave to a poor man, that's even more disgraceful. And so it's this weird culture that's created amongst the slaves, and almost like they're accepting their lot in life, which is something that Frederick Douglass will continue to point to, the fact that it's not their destiny, but the slave owners made it their destiny and they bought into it. And so it's just more difficult to break out of that mindset of slavery. And so that's why Frederick Douglass is continuing to write about his stories. So, um, yeah, continue reading and just more heartbreaking stories.